This video is sponsored by World Anvil. Daggerheart, the new tabletop RPG from the folks at Darrington Press, Critical Role's publishing arm, was finally released about 3 months ago, and it's been kind of a huge hit in the tabletop community. And so for the next week, I'm making videos all about Daggerheart, and we're going to talk about some of the mechanics and design choices, why they work the way they do, and in some of these episodes, I'm especially going to focus on some of the ways Daggerheart's design was directly inspired by the previous Critical Role campaigns, so they could not only create the perfect tabletop game for them to use in their own campaigns, to the point where it'd be kind of weird if they didn't use that system for their own campaign, and some of us might have very publicly predicted there was no way they were going to go back to D&D, but more on that some other time. But also, the design of Daggerheart gives the rest of us the tools we need to run games that are more like the games we see on Critical Role. This is Daggerheart Demystified. Ever since Daggerheart launched its open beta last year, I have been obsessed with the way it recommends you handle world building. You see, the core rulebook itself offers very little guidance in terms of a defined world that all Daggerheart games are assumed to share, and we'll talk a little bit more about the game's core world building assumptions in another video coming later this week. But instead, the game gives you some suggestions for how you can loop your players into the world building process. And I know some game masters have probably scratched their head at that. After all, we typically think of world building as being entirely the GM's domain. Matt Colville recently put out a terrific video where he opens by comparing player backstories to the GM's world building process, making the argument that any world building the GM does is really because it makes them more comfortable running the game, or it's just something they find fun. And he's frequently discussed how GMs should be prepared for the fact that their players may not typically engage with their world building. It's not for them. It's just something you do because you want it to. But inherent in that framing is the idea that world building is the game master's domain. And historically, I think that's absolutely true. But when Matt Mercer first built his campaign world for Critical Role, it was a much more collaborative process. And that's the approach that Daggerheart recreates. The game itself is trying to teach you how to build your world the same way Matt Mercer created Exandria. And that's what we're going to talk about today. If this topic seems cool to you and you're interested in it, make sure to like and subscribe, especially if you want to hear about more Daggerheart stuff. I haven't really had a chance to discuss it that much before now, but I've got a bunch of Daggerheart videos coming out over the next week because I really want to talk about it. And also, I was cursed by an algorithm wizard to make some extra videos, so that's also a factor. So if you want to make sure you catch all these videos, make sure to subscribe. Now, for those who are not up on their Critical Role real-world lore, I'll do a quick recap of how that game actually began. Matt offered to run a birthday game for his friend Liam O'Brien, and they played the one-shot using 4th edition D&D. The characters in this game were Vex, Vax, Grog, Tiberius, and Scanlan. And Taliesin was also there playing a Dragonborn Paladin, and Marisha was there, but she was acting more as the DM's assistant. She didn't have a character, she was just going around the table and helping the players find things on their character sheets, since with the exception of Taliesin, all the other players were basically completely new to D&D. Liam had played as a kid, but that was so long ago that he was effectively still a new player. After that first session, the players wanted to keep going with the campaign, so Matt moved the game into Pathfinder. Marisha joined the game as Keyleth, and they invited Ashley Johnson to play as well. She became Pike, and they established that she was Grog's best friend from childhood. And a few sessions later, Taliesin rejoined the campaign, now playing as Percy the Gunslinger. Now, for that first game, all Matt did was create the location for their first session, the swamp town of Stilben, and presumably some dungeon nearby where the players went on their first adventure. The second session saw them travel to the nearby city of Westron, where they picked up Pike and fought a necromancer in the towering mountain of Gatshadow. In the next session after that, they had to remove a curse placed on Grog, so some members of the party explored the nearby forest of the Frostweald. And this is essentially how Matt began to build Tal'dorei. With each new session, he would add something new to the map, and it would slowly branch out from where the party had started. It was like a video game where you slowly clear out the fog of war and discover more territory on the map. Only in this case, Matt was adding each of these locations to the map with each subsequent session. And this is the most common piece of advice given to new game masters who are building their own world. Don't worry too much about creating a whole world before you sit down and play, because you're just never going to feel ready that way. Just create a starting town, a nearby dungeon. If you have time, maybe throw in some rumors of other locations that might be further off the map, but just build enough so your players have somewhere they can go during that first session. I actually have a harder time with that approach for my games. I am one of those GMs who likes having a little bit more of a safety net, and knowing a lot more about the surrounding territory than just one starting town and one dungeon is kind of essential for me for the way I run my games. But I've been running games for something like 15 years at this point, so I've approached the game in lots of different ways over the years, and I found a system that makes me feel more comfortable at this specific point in my GM journey. So despite my personal preferences, I still think it's good advice to just start with the town, and I think that approach will probably work great for your games. And sure enough, eventually Matt was able to sketch out at least a rough drawing of what we now know as the continent of Tal'dorei, presumably by the time they reached the capital city of Amon, since they'd crossed the entire continent, so he'd probably taken the time to figure out what a lot of the landmass looked like. However, Matt did not invent every single location in Tal'dorei or every aspect of his world. because a lot of it was created in partnership with his players. See, Laura and Liam share a birthday in real life, so they decided to play twins in the game. So at some point, either before that first one-shot or after the game, when they knew the story was going to continue into a full campaign, Laura and Liam sat down in a diner and figured out their backstory together. They developed that they had been raised by their mother, a human woman living in Byroden. Then they established that their elven father came and took them to the elven city of Singorn to raise them to be proper members of elf society. But they faced a lot of bigotry for being half-elves, so when they were teenagers, they ran away and returned to their mother, only to find that the village had been destroyed by a dragon and their mother was dead. So they struck out on their own to become adventurers. And along the way, Vax became a member of the Clasp, the local thieves guild. So when Matt receives their backstory, suddenly this continent has a thieves guild and a city of snooty elves. And it was probably always going to have those things anyway. All great D&D worlds should have one of each of those things. But these had essentially been created by his players. I don't know if his players also named these locations and factions or if that was done by Matt's, but their existence was either generated or necessitated by their players' backstories. Grog's backstory tells us that there is a herd of roving Goliaths who pillage and raid and kill and devastate any community they come across. Grog was one of their members when he was young, but at a certain point he felt pity for one of their future victims, so he basically disobeyed orders and was punished for it. He was beaten and left for dead by his uncle Kevdak, the leader of the Herd of Storms. So Grog's backstory tells us that there's this roving gang of Goliaths out there, and that their leader has these magic items called the Titan Stone Knuckles. Because yes, those items were created by Travis as part of his character's backstory. He had no idea they would become a vestige of divergence or what that would even mean. He just gave his uncle these cool magic items to make him a more imposing villain. Tiberius's backstory gave us Draconia, a magical city-state full of Dragonborn, far away from where the adventures were taking place. I don't know if Orion had decided it would be on a different continent, or Matt made that decision later on, but it's across the sea from Stilben, which is the starting town, so it's easy to explain how this could be the first place Tiberius landed when he arrived in Tal'dorei. Tiberius's backstory had him hunting for forgotten magical relics that had basically been covered up by his society, so Orion literally gave Matt a list of some weird magic items he'd come up with. He didn't know what they did, he didn't know where they were, he didn't even know if they were all real. One of the items on the list was the Mending Wheel, which he did end up discovering in a pre-stream game. We also heard references to something called the Pale Stone. That was another item on his list that he'd been asking about, and Matt was establishing that it was somewhere in the Feywild. There's a lot of interesting material in this backstory because Matt could basically use these items to steer the players into any situation, with rumors that one of those items might be located there. And there was also the promise of more politics and court intrigue if the party ever arrived in Draconia and started dealing with his family and the factions there. Obviously, we never got to see the culmination of any of these plot points due to the way Orion left the show, and so it kind of worked out that by sheer coincidence, the details he created were either hidden across the world, or in the case of his homeland, it had been placed on a completely different continent. But earlier in that campaign, these elements of his backstory helped sketch in more details about the wider world. Scanlan's and Pike's backstories didn't give us quite as much to work with for today's exercise. Pike had some family she wasn't close to due to their unsavory reputation, and Scanlan had a mother who'd been killed by a goblin in a random raid, but I don't know how important that might be to the larger campaign, really. And he also had a troupe of musicians he traveled with as a young man, but he didn't pin down any concrete locations, at least none that we're aware of, speaking about it now, 10 years later. But then Keyleth joined the party, and we got a bunch of details to add to the world all at once. She's a druid and a member of a druidic community known as the Ashari, and her tribe is split across 4 locations around the world, each one guarding a portal to one of the 4 elemental planes. You can definitely tell that she played D&D before because her backstory involves D&D's canonical cosmology with her 4 tribes tied into these 4 elemental planes. And she has been selected as the next leader of the Air Ashari, so she's on a mission to go out into the world, become a stronger leader, and go visit each of the other 3 tribes so she can undergo a rite of passage and prove herself. So she's essentially given Matt 4 locations that are elementally charged in some way. And Matt's job is going to be to take them and make sure they're not all super close together to help explain why she can't just go from one to the other, but instead has to go on all these D&D adventures along the way. Marisha also helps a lot with that by making Keyleth very timid and unsure of herself, so she has more incentive to go on all these unrelated D&D adventures because she's literally procrastinating her rite of passage. But from a world-building perspective, Matt has 4 locations that shouldn't be that close to each other. They all wind up being roughly on the same hemisphere, but they're still pretty far apart. One of them is on a completely different continent, the opposite direction from where he placed Draconia. So not only would going to the Fire Ashari have to be a very separate mission from going to visit Draconia, for example, but it's also about as far away from where the player started as anything else could be. In fact, when you're talking about what is east and west from Tal'dorei, the starting location, the Fire Ashari is about as far west as anything Matt has ever put on the map of Exandria. And finally, we had Percy. And once again, Taliesin has played a lot of D&D, so he knows exactly what kind of backstory to give to his GM, especially because he's already played games with Matt, so he knew Matt's style. Percy's from the independent sovereign state of Whitestone, which is ruled by his family, the Durolos. He was one of the youngest of many, many children, and so he was never expected to rule Whitestone, so he could focus on more academic pursuits as a kid and become an expert in the sciences. Then one day, some strangers came to town, Lord and Lady Briarwood and their companions. They were welcomed in as guests, and in return, they butchered everyone in the castle and took over Whitestone. Percy barely managed to escape, and one day he hopes to return and get vengeance for his family. Taliesin gave Matt a whole list of important NPC names, including several that were etched into the barrel of his gun, and also gave him a spooky, weird, smoky shadow that whispered the idea for the gun in his ear in a dream, which gave Matt something else to play with as far as figuring out the main villain of that storyline. But also, Percy invented a whole other city, just like the snooty elf city created by Liam and Laura, or Orion's city of Dragonborn, or the different druid communities created by Marisha. But Matt's job is to figure out, where could Whitestone be that it would not be under the rule of the Emperor of Tal'dorei? Because otherwise, if it was within the limits of the Empire, then somebody probably would have noticed if there had been a violent coup 5 years ago. So it's in the top right corner of the map, the eastern corner, northeast corner, on the opposite side of the country from the capital city of Amon, and it's separated and sheltered by mountains, so it's very difficult to get word in or out of Whitestone. And that is basically exactly how Matt built Tal'dorei. We basically just watched it happen. But for his second campaign, Matt's approach was a little bit different. It seems like before any of the players created their characters, he sat down and did a whole lot more dedicated world building to flesh out the continent of Wildemount. But his players still came to him with details they wanted to include somewhere on the map. But in this case, it seems like most of them didn't create such major elements of world building this time around. We're going to keep this part vague since some people come to Critical Role through the cartoons, and the cartoon based on Campaign 2 is launching in a little bit more than a month, so we'll be vague about any potential spoilers here. Travis's character, who I'm not going to name the characters, but I could. You could probably Google that right now, but I'm going to keep it vague. But Travis's character did roughly the same thing he did with Grog. He didn't give us specific locations, but he gave us some NPCs. His backstory includes a ship full of characters, some of whom are either dead or missing. Laura established that her mother lived in a coastal city, but I don't know if she named the city or just picked one that existed on Matt's map. Likewise, Marisha created her character's family homestead and their family business, but it seems like she could have plopped it down anywhere on the map. And she made her character a member of an organization that existed in the world, but it had already been established in the first campaign, so she was working off of established lore and not introducing a new faction. Sam created a very small community that could, once again, be dropped anywhere. Taliesin worked a lot of gaps into his character's backstory that were left for Matt to fill in. There was no Whitestone this time around for Taliesin's character. Ashley, it seems like, took a fairly similar approach, tying her character to something Matt had already developed in another nation elsewhere on this map. She's basically built off of world building he did before the campaign. And Liam certainly has some of the biggest ties to the society of Wildemount, and his backstory definitely influenced the way one of the major factions in this nation would be depicted in the campaign. It was likely inspired by the way Liam used them in his character's backstory. So, generally speaking, it seems like for Campaign 2, Matt gave them a map and at least some loose details of this new nation he was building, the political tensions, the countries, that sort of thing, and then they figured out how their characters could fit in with what he had already come up with. But wherever it made sense, they also added details, although because we know Matt was world-building Wildemount before the campaign started, we don't know exactly which parts of that setting were created by Matt and which elements were added to fit character backstories. But with both campaigns, Matt made sure his players felt free to create whatever they wanted to for their backstories. It's just that with later campaigns, his players had more fun creating characters based off of things that had already been established. With Campaign 3, the players almost exclusively created characters based on lore that had already been established in the first two campaigns, with just a couple of exceptions. And that's the benefit of creating characters in a pre-existing campaign setting you already know really well, and we'll probably talk more about that some other time. But for that first campaign, the world of Exandria genuinely did not exist in any form before the characters were created, and so Matt molded the world around the details his players gave him. And so cut to about 10 years later, the team that works on Critical Role starts building their own role-playing game, and they started looking at ways to bring players into the world-building process. And so in the GM section of the Daggerheart core rulebook, because all the GM tools and the monsters and the player details are all in the same core rulebook, so you don't need to buy 2 or 3 books just to play the game, that's really nice. But in that section of the book, we get this section called Building a Map. At the start of a campaign, one of the most important questions to answer is, where are we? To do this, you'll choose one of the blank maps in the appendix or create your own, then print a copy of it out for your table. If you're utilizing a campaign frame, use the map detailed in that section. Digital copies of these maps are available on the Daggerheart website for download. If you know at character creation that you'll be running a campaign, you can bring a blank map to your session 0 to fill out together. Otherwise, you can always introduce it at the top of your next session to integrate into your game moving forward. Side note, I love that last sentence because they basically admit, you don't need to worry about this for a one-shot, but sometimes your one-shot unexpectedly becomes a campaign, so don't feel like you can't still do this once that happens. Just do it in the first session where you know you're running a campaign. That's so real. To start, place the map on the table and explain to the players that you'll be using it to build the region together. Choose the name of the region from the options available, or make up your own, and write that name on the sheet. If you're using a campaign frame, the name of the region is provided for you. I love that each of these maps comes with a list of suggested names. Naming stuff is so hard, I'll take any help I can get. Next, remind the players about any locations they have already created for the setting. Pass the map around and have them label the locations they created anywhere they'd like. Then choose one of the locations from the list on the sheet and add it to the map. Describe this place for the rest of the table. What is it? Why is it called this? What makes it so significant? Then pass the map to another player to do the same. Encourage them to tie in their character's backstory or history with the new location if they wish. As players describe the locations they've chosen, record any important information about them in your notes. The map should continue around the table like this until it feels like it is populated with enough exciting locations and plot hooks for you to work with. With 4 players, twice around the table is usually enough. Remember, you can always do this again at the top of another session to fill out the map further, or even introduce a new region that connects to the current one. After the table feels happy with the details they've added, take the map back and begin the adventure. Maybe it's somewhere the players have already added, or maybe it's a new place. Either way, this will help you orient yourself for the campaign moving forward. Filling space, leaving blanks. As part of the prep for your next session, you want to review the map your table built together. Think about how the locations your players created might affect the region, and add anything you think might be important or relevant to the sheet. For example, if someone labeled a spot with the Healing Fields, you might consider adding a town nearby that specializes in creating health potions or curing ailments, or a mage's tower that overlooks the fields to protect them. Pay attention to where the PCs currently are in their journey. Where might they consider going next? It's also important to leave blanks. Don't feel the need to fill everything in, and don't worry about planning out what every labeled landmark or town is like. Leaving some things vague gives you the freedom to adapt on the fly, and reduces the amount of world-building work you have to do for places your players might never visit. And then the book literally goes on to discuss how to incorporate player backstories into not just the map, but also how to use them to build story arcs. I made a video about that as well, but this section is really great. It even talks about how to use 3-act structure in your game, so I'll come back to this another day for some future video, probably as part of my series about story structure. Now, this approach to map building is directly inspired by the indie RPG, The Quiet Place. It literally says as much in the Daggerheart core rulebook. And I do think the mechanic of literally passing around a map and asking everyone to add details to it was borrowed from The Quiet Place. That makes perfect sense. But I think Daggerheart's designers chose to adopt this mechanic into their game because they wanted new Daggerheart groups to be able to design their worlds collaboratively, the same way Matt's players added details to Wildemount and especially to Tal'dorei. I think they saw an opportunity to adapt the system of The Quiet Place to help bring a little bit more critical role into every new Daggerheart group. However, this approach doesn't just recreate what Matt's players did when they added their homelands to Tal'dorei. It takes it to the next level, because there's something I noticed when I watched the Session 0 for Critical Role's Age of Umber miniseries. The players didn't just add safe havens or hometowns to the map, they added specific dangers. Taliesin created a spooky forest, Sam created some sinkholes. They basically added hazards to the map. Now, you can definitely argue that's what Taliesin did with Campaign 1, adding a bunch of murderers to a castle to the north, but that was really more of an adventure hook. Travis also introduced a roving gang of bad guys, which is also pretty good, but would be harder to put on a map. Don't get me wrong, you can absolutely still introduce something like that into your Daggerheart games. You can have villains in your backstory. But I think this approach of literally passing a map around basically encourages you to imagine where some dangers might be located. Now, my first impulse was to assume that this is just the cast of Critical Role being huge fans of drama. Of course, they're going to be the ones to add spooky dangers to the map because they want to see what happens when Matt takes that material and turns it into an adventure. I'm especially unsurprised when it's players like Taliesin and Sam, both of whom are very good at knowing that their own suffering is going to make for a better game experience, and by extension will make for better entertainment for the audience. But I actually think this is not just something you're going to get if you happen to have players that are as narrative focused as the cast of Critical Role is. I think a lot of groups might wind up populating the map with spooky forests and dangerous hazards and notorious beasties, because this process of building a map as your group empowers your players to essentially make a wish list of adventures they want to go on in future sessions. I've done that sometimes. I've asked my players what sort of adventures they want to go on, and when you do that, new players will basically tell you what sort of adventures they want to deal with in their campaign. A couple sessions ago, I asked my D&D group what sorts of things they wanted from upcoming games, and not everyone got back to me, but the ones who did told me they wanted difficult dungeons and cool magic items. Because when players are sitting at the table and they're in the middle of the action, they want to take the path of least resistance. They want their characters to try to take the easy way out whenever possible because it makes the most sense for what they would do in that situation. But when you can catch them out of character and ask them what sort of experiences they want, they are a lot more likely to tell you that they want certain types of adventures that are going to be more challenging. If a player points to a forest and says, this is Spiderweb Forest, and there are these huge spiders in there, and they worship their Spider King, and anybody who enters the forest either runs out screaming or never emerges at all, they're telling you that they want an adventure that's going to bring them into Spiderweb Forest. They want to play through the giant spiders in the forest scene from The Hobbit or the Chamber of Secrets. If one of the players points to a mountain on the map and says that a dragon landed there and started sleeping, and all the townspeople below are terrified it's going to wake up again and kill them, so the town is entirely silent, like The Quiet Place, they want to go to the super spooky, silent village beneath the sleeping dragon. By the way, that idea started as a riff on the sleeping dragon near Lake Town from, once again, The Hobbit, but then it became something else, and that's very cool, and I'm definitely planning on putting that in one of my games at some point, either as a game master, running games like D&D or Shadowdark, or as a player, adding features to a map in a Daggerheart campaign. Because that's the next really cool thing this process can do for your party. It encourages your players to exercise a form of creativity that they really never get to experience as players outside of when they create their own backstories. It encourages them to think of dynamic dangers, cool location names, and strange communities. It encourages them to operate within the tone you've presented for your players, either through the campaign frame you're using or the homebrew world you're presenting at Session 0. It encourages the players to do something that normally only the GM does, to world build. And doing this in Session 0 starts the process of breaking down the barriers that typically exist between the players and the Game Master, where they typically assume that all the world building is done by the Game Master before they sit down at the table, and that all the details the players are going to interact with are all conceived by the GM before the session ever starts. When I watch the folks from Darrington Press and Critical Role play Daggerheart, or even just talk about it on a live stream, I always had a harder time with the idea that the GM might ask the players to describe certain locations or characters. Giving over that level of control just feels kind of alien to me based on my years in the hobby. But one of the design goals of Daggerheart is to break the GM's monopoly on describing and defining the world of the game. And that starts with Session 0, when the GM doesn't just tell the players where the game is taking place. Instead, you ask them to help shape that world along with you. And of course, once you've all worked together to build your shared world, you're going to want some way to keep track of all the details you've developed. So you should use World Anvil, the sponsor of today's video. World Anvil is an incredible online toolkit that you can use to create wiki-style articles for any aspect of your world. You can make articles for different nations, or factions, or locations, or monsters, or NPCs. So after your Session 0, when you've created the world with your players, you can take all this information they gave you, type it up, and turn each important location into its own article. And then you can send these links to your players, and they can actually see everything they suggested all presented in this authoritative manner where it's now definitively part of the world. And in fact, you can take these Daggerheart maps and upload them directly to World Anvil and then link the articles to specific locations on the map. I'm getting ready to run a Daggerheart game for some friends across the country, and because we can't pass the map around the table, we're going to have to basically work digitally when they add details to the map during Session 0. But then I can take the blank map and put it in World Anvil and link the articles to these specific locations on the map. So during our first game session, if my players want to go back and reference something that we came up with during Session 0, they can just use the World Anvil link and see all the information presented in one place, where they can actually interact with it. And of course, if I want to hide my own secrets in these articles that the players don't know about yet, World Anvil empowers me to do that as well. I can include locations on the map or details in an article that only I can see. So that way, my players can have the articles open in front of them when they play, and I can open the articles on my side, and I'll see all the same information they do, as well as any other added information that's really just there for my own reference, or is some sort of surprise or reveal that my players haven't discovered yet. But Daggerheart also encourages collaborative world building, and with World Anvil you can actually give your players the power to edit your articles and add details they came up with. If you want, you can just do that during Session 0 so you're all working on the articles together, or you can keep that option open to them throughout the course of the campaign, and turn to them during the game and ask them to come up with information, and once they do, they could just type it directly into the article themselves, so you're all building this world together, and doing so collaboratively. And World Anvil is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you could save 51% off of any annual membership. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. Thank you so much for watching, and make sure to keep watching this channel, because I was cursed by an algorithm wizard to keep making Daggerheart videos for the next week, which means you're going to get another Daggerheart video really soon. So make sure you subscribe to the channel, ring the bell, make sure you're notified whenever I drop new videos. And if you're able to financially support the content in any way, consider supporting me on Patreon or becoming a YouTube member. You can get ad-free versions of my videos, and you get to vote on videos that I'll make in the future. There's another poll up there right now to choose another topic you want to hear me talk about. And if you want to stay up to date with everything I've got going on, check out my newsletter. You can sign up for that down below. Click here to check out another video I just put out talking about using cutaways in your games. If you're running a Daggerheart game of your own, that technique might really help you. And also, if you're new to the channel and you're wondering what am I talking about when I talk about an algorithm wizard, you'll get some more context in that video. Until next time, play fair and have fun.